Hi there, welcome. This is the Kelly's Astrology podcast, where you can find insight, guidance, and understanding through astrology. I'm Kelly, and I'll be your host. Hey there, everyone, and welcome to another episode of the Kelly's Astrology podcast. Today's episode is inspired by a couple of different quotes that are about being who you are, as well as kind of some thoughts on how to work with Jupiter and Saturn in 2025. It's still very early in the new year, and I know many of you will be thinking about goals or resolutions or intentions for 2025. And so I wanted to share a couple of tips about working with Jupiter and Saturn in 2025. Kind of as a guide, or as if you could use these as inspiration for any intentions that you might be setting for yourself. Now, before we get into that a little bit more, if you do want even more insight about the astrology, the astrological forecast for 2025, my 2025 year ahead forecast webinar is now available for immediate download. So you can find out more about that or grab your copy over at kellysastrology.com. So I want to start with a couple of quotes, which will make sense once I share them with you, because there's this real sense, I know, at the turn of the year around the year ahead and like this new me or this new kind of life I'm going to create for myself. And I have been reflecting on that for myself, and there's been a couple of quotes that I've found helpful. So I'm going to share them with you today in case you find them helpful as well. So this quote has really been inspiring me, and it does seem sort of relevant with this new year focus. So this quote is by Marion Woodman, and it says, "It is easier to try to be better than you are than to try to be who you are." And so I love this quote because it really kind of stopped me in my tracks when I first read it, that we spend so much time and energy, money, output, effort to try to be better than who we are. And we don't spend a lot of time or energy exploring who we are or trying to just be who we are. And so this quote really got me thinking, and it sort of called me back to, it is really important just to be myself, not necessarily like the best version of that, just the real version of that. And that quote led me to another quote, which is a quote that I've used in teaching in the past. Now, this quote is by Dr. Edith Eger, and I've read a couple of her books, which I recommend incredibly highly. Dr. Edith Eger is an American psychologist, and she's also a Holocaust survivor. So this quote, which is from her second book, it says, "We do not change until we're ready. Change is about interrupting the habits and the patterns that no longer serve us. When you change your life, it isn't to become the new you, it's to become the real you." Now, that quote is from a beautiful book called The Gift, 12 Lessons to Save Your Life, and that's by Dr. Edith Eger. And both of these quotes are speaking to kind of just being who you are, being the real you, rather than trying to become some sort of new or better version of you. And that, I think, is a really valid undertaking, a really worthy undertaking, and it might kind of call you into a more authentic or meaningful sort of contemplation of this idea of resolutions or intentions for a new year. So if you are thinking about, it's 2025, I want to make some changes for the year ahead, maybe we're thinking about some of those more internal changes rather than a lot of those external things. And then with those quotes as inspiration, I wanted to then weave in two planets that I use all the time in timing. Arguably my two favorite planets for timing, which are Jupiter and Saturn. And one of the simplest ways to connect with the energy of Jupiter and Saturn in terms of timing, so perhaps by transit, for instance, or maybe via perfection or some other Time Lord system that you might be working with. When I'm thinking about Jupiter and Saturn via timing, I'm thinking a lot about adding and subtracting. And this isn't going to turn into a maths class, but rather I'm thinking about how in a Saturn transit, you are really called to remove or reduce or minimize certain things in your life to make less of what's going on, usually so that you can make more of what's really important. But to do that, we have to get rid of things first. Whereas in a Jupiter transit, we're often thinking about the adding, the expanding, the upgrade. So when I'm thinking about Saturn transits and Jupiter transits, particularly in the context of, the year ahead, I'm thinking about where and how is Saturn calling me to reduce or minimize or streamline or simplify, and where and how might Jupiter be guiding me to expand or to experiment or to add in. And so if we weave these ideas of adding and subtracting, working with Jupiter and Saturn into the year ahead, into 2025, let's explore what that might look like. And we'll kind of keep that intention from those two quotes about not necessarily trying to be sort of a more polished, better, social media version of myself, but rather how could I be a more real, core, true version of myself. And I love this idea of adding and subtracting. Often we think we have to add things in to make our lives better. And one of the great teachings that comes from the planet Saturn, but is also embedded in a lot of the Stoic philosophies, is this idea that actually we often get to this place of clarity and simplicity when we take things out of our life. And that is definitely an approach that Saturn is all about. So let's start with Jupiter. And what we're going to do is just take a look at what Jupiter's doing by transit in the course of 2025 to see how that might inspire the adding in process that you could do. So in 2025, Jupiter will spend part of the year in Gemini and then part of the year in Cancer. So Jupiter will be in Gemini until June 9. We've just got a little furry friend joining us here. So Jupiter will be in Gemini until June 9, and then it's going to move into Cancer. So from the perspective of Jupiter and this idea of adding in or expanding, we've got the first half of 2025, which is the Jupiter and Gemini part of the year. And then we have the second half of 2025, which is the Jupiter in Cancer part of the year. So Jupiter in Gemini, which we have until June 9, this is a more scattered, kind of bouncy version of Jupiter. There is a shorter focus that Jupiter in Gemini has. It's more flexible. It's definitely more changeable. And that's a mix of the nature of the sign of Gemini as well as the qualities of a planet in detriment, which is something that Jupiter is when it's in Gemini. So when we think about adding things in under Jupiter and Gemini, we might be opting for these kind of short test runs, this idea of a trial. Let's try this, 3-week thing or this 4-week thing. The idea of trying something for a short period as an experiment. This is very much the adding in process of Jupiter and Gemini. You might be following your curiosity. I've always been interested in this, so let's take a weekend class or an online training. Maybe you're focusing on things to do with the air element or the planet Mercury, which of course Jupiter in Gemini is expanding. And that might lead you to new kinds of connections or new technology, maybe using technology in new ways. Might be that there's a focus on new learning in general, or the idea of this new experience, experimental kind of approach to life. This is all very much Jupiter in Gemini. And Jupiter in Gemini is really about learning and growing through gathering data, trying things out, seeing what happens. Now, this isn't a new cycle. Remember, Jupiter moved into Gemini in mid-2024. So we're well into this process, but it does continue for the first half of 2025. Now, Jupiter going into Cancer around June 9, is a very different kind of Jupiter. And so the process of adding in or expanding or improving things that we do in the second half of 2025, it feels different. Jupiter in Cancer is a more sustained and nourishing kind of Jupiter. So here you might be willing to initiate a new plan, a new protocol, a new habit, but now you do so with the view of honoring your choice over time. So Jupiter and Gemini, kind of short, bouncy, trying things out, but for a limited time. Jupiter in Cancer is like, I really want to feel into this because once I get it going, I want to stick with it over time. And that is partly due to the nature of Cancer, which as a water sign ruled by the moon has this real sticky kind of, ongoing quality. And partly, of course, to do with the nature of a planet in exaltation, which tends to have just generally more of a consistent quality. So when you're thinking of adding things in the second half of 2025, as inspired by Jupiter in Cancer, you might be more about researching and planning before diving in. So you might be slower to get going, but we're going to have more follow through, more of that sustained continuity. With Jupiter in Cancer, you might be really exploring what would feel comfortable and what might feel safe for you. You might also be reflecting on, what might you be able to continue with as a tradition or as a new ritual. So Jupiter in Cancer is that idea of new rituals and new traditions that we want to grow and expand over time. With Jupiter in Cancer, you might be focusing on the adding in of things to do with the water element or the moon. That might be adding in things that help you with your emotions or your feelings, that are about helping you with this sensitivity quality. They may be helping you with matters to do with history, with home, or with safety, or around food and caring for your body. So, thinking about what's a sustainable way for you to nourish your body, whether that's through food or emotional care and connection and support. These are things that may become more important once Jupiter gets into Cancer from June of 25. Of course, you can go further in personalizing how and where you might want to add things in with Jupiter in Gemini and then Jupiter in Cancer. And you would do that by considering the topics of the Gemini house and the Cancer house in your personal chart. So if you know your chart, think about the part of your chart where you have Gemini as an area of your life where you're wanting to make those upgrades or you're adding something in. And then we would do the same with the Cancer part of our chart after June of 25. So let's turn our attention now to Saturn. So it's hopefully given you a few ideas of the kind of adding in themes and perhaps some of the topics of Jupiter in Gemini and then Jupiter in Cancer. So let's switch to Saturn. Now, Saturn is going to spend most of the year in Pisces in 2025. Saturn does have a short tour through Aries. End of May, Saturn moves into Aries, and by the 2nd of September, Saturn is back in Pisces. So if you're thinking about 2025 as a whole, from that bird's eye perspective, the Saturn in Aries months are very much the middle of the year, June, July, and August. So we do have two kinds of Saturn to work with in 2025. So let's start with Saturn in Pisces, again, which will be a familiar transit to you because Saturn moved into Pisces back in March of 2023. So we've all been working with this vibe for nearly 2 years already. And Saturn in Pisces is going to continue to invite you to reduce or remove tasks or people or obligations that are draining your energy, that are deflating you emotionally, and that might be dulling your spirit. You could think of Saturn in Pisces as a call to reconnect with the divine, maybe to a call to remember your dreams or to reconnect with your spiritual self. And to do that, you might need to subtract something that is preventing you from doing so. A really simple example. Maybe you want to meditate every day, but you don't have time, yet you notice that you're spending 2 hours a day on social media. Maybe subtracting one will facilitate the other. Cut your social media time down by a half, and you'll have time, more than enough time to meditate. And I know that sounds like a lot, 2 hours a day, but I think the statistics show that the majority of people spend even longer than that on social media, which is mind-boggling for all of us, I think. So that's just a little bit of a clue that sometimes with Saturn, we're reminded of what's important and we get clear on what's blocking or preventing us getting to the important things. And that those blocks or those preventative things, that's what we want to remove or reduce or at least minimize for ourselves. Now, Saturn is in Pisces, which is a sign ruled by Jupiter, a benefic planet. And so this longer trend of Saturn in Pisces might actually help you get back on track with activities or hobbies that really soothe your soul, that make you feel good, that move your spirit, maybe that give you a sense of meaning or help you feel purposeful. And that might first come from being a little honest about what you're involved in that's not doing that. So, what are you doing that doesn't feel purposeful, that isn't giving you a sense of meaning? What hobbies or activities are you involved in that are just kind of sucking up your time without giving you anything substantial or meaningful or inspirational in return? And once you get clear on that, that's what you can subtract or remove. So Saturn in Pisces, I think Saturn transits in general are really about removing what you've outgrown, that pruning energy of getting rid of the dead wood. This has served its purpose. This was a beautiful tree for many years in the garden, and now it's blocking the light for the new things that are coming through, or it's gotten old and it needs a good pruning to kind of get it back into a reasonable proportion. So that idea of pruning or like downsizing or scaling down is something that Saturn really wants us to work on. Saturn in Pisces specifically might be helping you remember some of your bigger, more substantive dreams, those kind of dreamy fantasies about the kind of most exciting or interesting life you could lead. And when you get back in touch with those, you tune into them and you feel them, it may help you realize what has distracted you away from that. So that's Saturn in Pisces, which will be most of 2025. But we do have this 3-month period of Saturn in Aries in the middle of 2025 as well. So for that period, which is really June, July, August in the bulk of it, the idea of subtraction there still applies, but now we're thinking about experiences or activities that might actively irritate or aggravate you. Maybe there are people you're involved in or duties that you've kind of just continued, even though you're frustrated by them, or they actually aggravate and unsettle or even anger you. And these are going to be the things to remove or reduce or minimize your exposure to. The qualitative energy there is different, isn't it? Saturn is in Aries, a sign ruled by Mars, and that might mean there is more of a bold or dramatic kind of removal or exit strategy required. Saturn is in detriment in Aries, and so we're going to have a little bit more of that trial and error, maybe hit and miss quality. And it might mean that your intention to subtract things for that 3 months in the middle of the year when Saturn is in Aries, there could lead to some short-term tension or disagreement, or it might reveal where your priorities are different from those around you. So we've got a little bit more of that heated kind of friction with Saturn in Aries. Still the same process, but it's a little bit more about this is actively an annoying thing. So why am I doing it? Okay, let's stop. Or this thing has bothered me, but somebody else might love it. And how do you negotiate that? Saturn in Aries definitely has a more of an immediate kind of short-term focus, and that can make you feel like this sort of sense of urgency. Whether it's kind of real and necessary or not is maybe not the point. With Saturn in Aries, there can be this sort of urgent or fearful sort of worry that if I don't make this change right away, there's going to be a bigger problem in the future. So cutting things away maybe more immediately could be a necessity with Saturn in Aries. Saturn in Pisces, because it's ruled by Jupiter, so we have like a Saturn-Jupiter combo there that has more of a longer-term, big-picture focus. And Saturn in Pisces has a little bit more patience around slowly unwinding patterns that have been in place for some time. Whereas Saturn in Aries is a little bit more reactive, let's do it now, immediate, like cut it away. Saturn in Aries could be a little bit more, act first and think later type of thing. In either instance, I'm hoping that you're getting this feeling that working with Saturn can help you reduce or minimize duties that have begun to deplete you more than they are offering you any of those great Saturn things, more than they're offering you security or stability or protection. So, if we kind of take a step back, we've talked a lot about working with Jupiter, working with Saturn, these ideas of adding and subtracting, and these concepts that we got to via our quotes at the start about how do I get closer to the real me? And, every year we're always having influences from both Jupiter and Saturn. And this idea of getting closer to the real you is a mix of what do I need to subtract or take out of my life? And what is going to be useful or meaningful for me to bring in to my life? So, if we summarize this, working with Jupiter can help you add in some of those meaningful or enriching or even just interesting experiences that help you grow by being outside your comfort zone, trying new things. Working with Saturn can help you clarify who or what is really important and in turn help guide you towards what is blocking you doing more of what's important. And those things that are getting in the way of what's really important, that's what we want to reduce or remove or minimize with Saturn. So, tuning into the planets, I believe, is ultimately about helping you become more of who you really are rather than trying to be something that you're not. And that kind of approach, I think, is always a valid undertaking, whether it's something that you always come to at the start of the year, whether, like me, this is something that you actually choose to focus on around your birthday, which is a little bit more of an astrologically inspired time to do so. Or maybe you've just come to a point in your journey through this life where you've got some capacity, you've got some space and time to attend to this process of becoming more of the real you. And the cat definitely agrees. She's just putting her stamp on things here as well. Of course, there is a lot more to working with the transits of Jupiter and Saturn than just these ideas. But what I wanted to share today was a few places to begin in terms of working with Jupiter and Saturn through this lens of the year ahead, but also just understanding how they are trying to work with you in this process of becoming, which is really, what we're all here to try to do in this lifetime. And so let me know how you are planning to work with Jupiter and Saturn in 2025. If you know that you're having a really specific degree-based transit from Saturn and Jupiter in the year ahead, you can apply these same concepts. What do I need to distill down around this Saturn transit? Or what do I need to expand and amplify under this Jupiter transit? So love to hear your experiences in the comments below. As always, there is even more week ahead astrology tips and insights inside the Astrology Guide membership. So you can find out more or join us in the community over at kellysastrology.com. Thanks so much for joining me here this week, team. I look forward to sharing more again next week. Bye for now. Hey there, everyone. Thanks so much for listening to this week's show. You might have noticed that towards the end of the show, I make a little blooper. So I just want to correct myself here so I don't leave you with an incorrect term to take forward. So towards the end of the episode, I'm talking about Saturn in Aries, and I state that Saturn in Aries is in detriment, which is wrong. Saturn in Aries is the fall placement for Saturn. So I wanted to quickly correct myself here so that you get the correct terminology to take forward. So yes, there is a blooper towards the end of the episode. Hopefully this clarifies things, and I appreciate your understanding, everyone. Thanks again for listening, and I will see you next week.